Stories are sudden changes. My name is Osadumebi, and every week I usually tell you a short story written by a Nigerian writer or author. But this is series week, where I tell you a story over the course of 2 or 7 consecutive days. Basically, however long it takes to complete the story. Series week will occur once a quarter, and the stories featured will still be written by Nigerian writers and authors, and will either consist of a sequence of related episodes from one story, or a set of stories linked by a common theme. That's the long and short of it. So without much ado, today's story is by Kesiena Olunwa, and it's the third part of the story titled The Good Neighbor. Catch up on earlier episodes for parts 1 and 2, and listen in tomorrow for part 4. Holding the piece of paper in my hand, I sank into our couch. I had not really thought about the divorce and what it would mean, for me and especially for Elora. What was I going to tell her? How was I going to explain a divorce and what it might mean for her? What impact would this have on her? Should I even tell her? Bayo was never around. Surely we could continue as we were, and Elora would be none the wiser of what was truly happening. Who was I kidding? Elora adored her father. He always let her have her way with every and anything. He was the good cop of this family. Bayo had put me in a difficult position, but I was not going to sit around feeling sorry for myself. I forced myself out of the chair. I had to pick up Elora. I headed for the bedroom to change, and then went over to Alex's house. This was the longest I had ever been away from my daughter. I had never trusted anyone to look after her. And yet, here I was trusting Alex with her care. Yes, we'd known Alex and Jessica a few months now, and they'd been lovely. But he was still a stranger to some degree. I pressed the buzzer and waited. No response. I pressed it again, and still no response. With my earlier thoughts, I immediately began to panic. 1,001 scenarios kept playing in my head. Where the hell was I going to say I went, and who on earth was I going to say I left my daughter with? Alex had been the one who suggested I stay at the hotel. What if he had kidnapped Elora and disappeared, not even wanting a ransom? What was I going to tell Bayo? What would people think of me? I pressed the buzzer repeatedly and banged at the door intermittently as my imagination kept running wild. Alex finally opened the door. A kitchen towel across one shoulder, and he was covered in what seemed like flour. "I'm so sorry about the delay. There was a little situation in the kitchen with the girls." I walked in and heard giggles coming from the kitchen. I spotted Elora and Jessica dipping their fingers in a bowl and licking what I assumed to be butter. They looked so happy and content. I shook my head at my riotous thoughts as I walked towards them smiling. "Mommy!" Elora ran over excited and gave me the biggest hug. Jessica wasn't too far behind. I stooped down and squeezed them both tightly. "What in the world is going on here?" I asked, puzzled at the state of the kitchen. "Daddy is teaching us how to make waffles," Jessica responded as Alex walked back into the kitchen. "And besides the mess, they're actually doing a fantastic job." The girls giggled. "But what is learning without a little chaos?" he finished, smiling. He continued with his tutorial and showed them how to prep the waffle maker before scooping batter into it. I sat and watched them take turns. Elora looked her happiest. Nothing else mattered but this. This was all the peace I needed. I wasn't sure if this was meant to be breakfast or lunch. Regardless, It was a meal consumed with much pride and glee. The girls were really pleased with their effort and were reeling off other things they wanted to learn how to make. Our meal was done, and the girls disappeared to watch TV while Alex and I cleared the mess in the kitchen. I spoke briefly about the note from Bayo. Alex assured me I was going to be all right, and he offered assistance with lawyers if I needed it. When I was finally back home with Elora, the house didn't feel quite the same. Bayo was rarely home, so why was there this sudden feeling of emptiness? I focused my gaze on Elora. She couldn't stop talking about the amazing time she'd had at the sleepover and how cool Uncle Alex was. As I pottered about the house listening to Elora's "Mommy this" and "Mommy that," I couldn't shake the feeling of foreboding, and my earlier stranger danger thoughts resurfaced. I hoped to God the foreboding didn't relate to Alex. And then my mind went to Bayo. I wondered when his lawyers would get in touch and what his terms would be. Just then, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to a strange-looking man in his 30s. He introduced himself as Mark, the new owner of my house. I burst out laughing. It had to be a joke. We were not renting, so it's not like anyone could just waltz in without notice and announce they were the new occupants. This was definitely a joke, or he must have the wrong address. But Mark was adamant that he had the right address, and I was insistent that he had made a mistake. So I asked for proof, and he walked back to his car, which was parked out front. There was a truck parked directly behind his car. It looked like it had his things inside. This was so bizarre. Mark came back with several documents, one of which was a certificate of ownership. I scanned the papers in shock. This was not happening. It had to be a bad dream. Bayo had sold our home, and according to the inventory on the document of sale, he had included all the furniture and white goods. That bastard initiated the sale of our home a few months back, and it had only just completed. Mark was getting impatient. He was told the property had been vacated, but that someone would meet him here to hand over the keys. He had turned up prepared to move in, and he intended to do just that. Elora came to the door, and I could see Mark soften. I pleaded for a few minutes and rushed over to Alex's with Elora. He was surprised to see me and had to ask me to slow down a few times. When I finally became coherent, he was gobsmacked. Jessica and Elora had busied themselves with goodness knows what, as Alex and I raced back to my apartment, which technically was no longer mine. Alex and Mark went back and forth for a few minutes while I stood there, willing myself to wake up from this nightmare. Mark finally agreed to give us a few hours to move our stuff, on the condition that we would pay the moving team for the extra time they would spend waiting. It was the worst few hours of my life. I hated packing at the best of time, talk less of packing under these conditions. I was so disoriented, but thankfully Alex was clear-headed. He asked questions and I answered. He gave instructions and I followed. He fetched our suitcases from where I said they were, and he asked me to pack up Elora's room first, and then move on to my room. He dashed back to his place and grabbed a few of their suitcases and brought them back to me in the rooms. He also grabbed some boxes he and Jessica had used to move in a few months back and started packing up the kitchen and the living room. With every item I packed away, I cursed Bayo under my breath. This was clearly an intentional and well-calculated move. Alex was incidental. I shuddered to think what would have happened to me if he and Jessica had not moved in. Alex came back into the rooms intermittently to check on me. Only God knows what he told the moving team, but he managed to talk them into helping me. They helped him rearrange his garage to make room for my stuff, Then they moved the kitchen and living room boxes Alex had packed up into the garage. They also moved the suitcases I had filled up into the guest room at Alex's house. I was to share it with Elora till I got something else sorted. I still couldn't fathom how I had ended up homeless in the space of a few hours. With the way my head was throbbing, I was surprised it had not exploded with the volume of information it was struggling to absorb and process. Nobody deserved this kind of treatment, least of all me. When we were done, Alex paged the moving guys, and then he paused briefly to speak with Mark, before walking back to where I stood, dazed. He literally had to steer me back to his place. As we walked in, I could see the confusion on Elora and Jessica's faces. They had quietly watched the frenzied move of boxes and suitcases. This was beyond any sleepover they may have planned. It was only a matter of time before the questions they must have been whispering between themselves came tumbling out. Questions I had no answers to. I'd barely slept when the sun cracked the sky the next morning. I had spent the night tossing and turning, sobbing silently so I didn't disturb anyone. Thankfully, Elora slept in Jessica's room. I was planning on how to avoid her and the impending questions when I heard a knock on the door. It was Alex. He walked in with a cup of chamomile tea, a box of tissues, and a bottle of Vicks. Gosh, on one of the worst days of my life, God had made provision for an angel to be close by. I must have looked a sorry sight, but he just smiled and asked how I was holding up. I grunted a response as I sat up in bed. He placed the items on the bedside table and sat on the edge of the bed facing me. Fisayo, I know you are probably still trying to make sense of the past 24 hours, but you need to find the words to explain the situation to Elora. We can address the girls together, if that will help. Or I can take Jessica out for a bit to give you and Elora some space. The tears began to flow again. He paused, handed me the box of tissues, and continued explaining how important it was for Elora to know what was going on, and how keeping her in the dark would do more harm than good. I nodded, but said nothing as I dabbed my eyes. He remained seated at the edge of the bed, watching me and waiting for a response. I appreciated the distance, the space, what with my emotions being all over the place. It would be a great help if you and Jessica were around when I speak with Elora. I finally managed. He nodded and got up to leave. Alex. He stopped and turned towards me. His eyes were misty. Thank you, I whispered. He nodded. I'll see to the girls. Join us whenever you're ready. Bolstered by my conversation with Alex, I hauled myself out of bed and took a hot shower. I came out of the room and followed the voices to the dining room. The girls came over to hug me. They had made breakfast with Alex. We all sat down to eat. Mommy, are we staying here forever? Elora asked. Alex glanced at me and nodded in encouragement. No, sweetie. Just till Mommy figures out a few things and we find somewhere else to stay. But Mommy, why do we need somewhere else to stay? What about our house? And how would Daddy find us? Valid, honest, and innocent questions, but each one chipping away at the facade I had put up to face them all at breakfast. I took a deep breath before responding. Well, we no longer have access to our old house because Daddy and Mommy won't be living together anymore. I answered, hoping that would be the end of the questions. Mommy, are you and Daddy getting a divorce? And does that mean we can live with Uncle Alex and Jessica? Can Uncle Alex become my new daddy so that Jessica can be my sister? Elora, honey, unfortunately, there are a lot of questions that Mommy does not yet have the answers to. All of this is still new for Mommy, and there's a lot Mommy is trying to figure out. But what? Elora. I reached my hand across to her and clasped her hand on the table. Please, Mommy needs a few days to figure out what to do. Let us just have some food for now, okay? I said, squeezing her hand. Okay, Mommy. I had given her enough for now and bought myself a little more time. I knew there would be a lot more questions over the coming days, but we'll have to cross that bridge when we get to it. Right now, I was more concerned by the fact she knew what a divorce meant. As far as I could remember, I had never used the word around her. Neither had we discussed it in any context whatsoever before now. It was clear there was a lot I didn't know about my daughter, and that got me worried. She was only 6 years old, for crying out loud. And I could not stop thinking about how quickly she was willing to replace her dad with Alex. This is mad. A couple of days later, as I sat in the living room trying to make sense of some documents, the doorbell rang. Alex went to answer it. He walked back in bemused, with a middle-aged man in tow. The man introduced himself as Mr. Agumbiade's legal counsel and asked if I was Mrs. Agumbiade. I confirmed I was, and he handed me the brown envelope he was holding. I opened it. I had been officially served divorce papers. I did not bother asking how he'd known where to find me. I tore into the envelope and started reading through the document, searching for what to me was the most important detail. I found it. Bayo wasn't contesting custody. That was all I needed to know. Everything else was irrelevant. I didn't hesitate to sign. There was nothing to fight for. Besides, I did not have the strength to battle Bayo in court or to prolong this ordeal. It was obvious our relationship meant nothing to him. Elora meant nothing to him. I wasn't going to waste my time on the idiots. Good riddance, I thought, as I handed back the envelope. Kesiena Olunwa is a writer who resides in Lagos, Nigeria. She is an entrepreneur and loves networking. To connect and read more of her work, visit her Instagram page at fictiononlyng. Details and links will be in the episode description. If you've got a story you would like to be featured on this podcast, or a published book you want to make into an audiobook, send an email to info@osadumebi.com or send me a message at osadumebi on either Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or X. I look forward to collaborating with you. And if you've enjoyed this week's episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and tell someone, everyone, that stories are a good escape for a few minutes each week.